The $3 million prototype engine sat dead on Sinclair Industries' marble conference table like a chrome coffin. Veronica Ashford's manicured fingers drummed against leather as 12 executives stared at their company's death sentence. Tomorrow's Tokyo presentation. 50 million in funding, all hanging on a machine that refused to breathe. The cleaning cart's squeaky wheel announced Cameron Cross's arrival, his worn uniform a stark contrast to the sea of tailored suits. But something flickered in his weathered face as he studied the failed engine, something that made Veronica's desperation boil over into mockery. Her voice cut through the boardroom's suffocating silence like a blade. "If you can fix what our $1 million team couldn't, I'll marry you." The cruel laughter that followed would haunt her for months. When Veronica's desperation finally exploded into a brutal challenge that would change everything, nobody could have predicted what the silent janitor would do next. Cameron's hands stilled on the mop handle, the worn plastic grip familiar beneath his calloused fingers. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his weathered features that told stories of sleepless nights and small victories. For 17 seconds, the conference room held its breath, waiting for the punchline to land like a cruel joke in corporate theater. But Cameron didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. His eyes remained fixed on the prototype's ceramic cooling system, studying the intricate components with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient's heart. The thermal expansion joints were installed backwards, a rookie mistake that would have been obvious to anyone who understood the fundamental principles of thermodynamics. Cameron had written his MIT thesis on exactly this type of system integration, back when his biggest worry was impressing professors rather than explaining to his 8-year-old daughter why Daddy had to work nights to pay for her art supplies. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest academic achievement now mocked him from a boardroom where he existed only as invisible labor. "Ma'am." Cameron's voice carried the quiet weight of someone who'd learned to speak carefully around people who held his livelihood in their manicured hands. "I appreciate the confidence, but I'm just maintenance staff." His words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, each syllable carefully chosen to deflect attention, while his mind automatically calculated pressure differentials and heat dissipation rates. The executives shifted in their Italian leather chairs, already losing interest in the brief entertainment that had interrupted their crisis management meeting. Patterson, the chief engineer, cleared his throat with the authority of someone who'd spent 23 years climbing corporate ladders by stepping on the backs of people exactly like Cameron. His Armani suit cost more than Cameron made in 2 months, a fact that wasn't lost on either man as they sized each other up across the social divide that separated blue collars from corner offices. "Ms. Ashford, perhaps we should focus on realistic solutions rather than—" He gestured dismissively at Cameron, his Rolex catching the light like a golden middle finger. "This circus act." The other executives nodded in synchronized agreement, their movements like well-trained vultures sensing carrion in the corporate wasteland. Henderson, the silver-haired board member, pulled out his phone to check the Tokyo Stock Exchange, already calculating damage control strategies. Walsh, the junior engineer, nervously adjusted his thick glasses, grateful that someone else had become the focus of executive frustration. But Veronica's attention remained locked on the janitor who stood perfectly still, studying their $3 million failure with the intensity of someone who actually understood what he was looking at. The scent of industrial cleaner mixed with expensive cologne as Cameron stepped closer to the conference table, his work boots making no sound on the marble floor. Decades of night shifts had taught him to move like a ghost through corporate hallways, invisible until someone needed a wastebasket emptied or a coffee stain removed from imported carpeting. "The cooling system," he said quietly, almost to himself, his voice barely audible over the air conditioning's mechanical whisper. "Thermal expansion joints are backwards. Creates pressure cascade failure throughout the entire heat management network." His words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion among the suited executives who'd spent the last 18 months throwing money at a problem they didn't truly understand. Cameron's diagnosis was clinical, precise, delivered with the calm authority of someone who thought in differential equations and dreamed in mechanical systems. But to the men in expensive suits, he was still just the night janitor offering unsolicited opinions about technology that cost more than his annual salary. Henderson leaned forward with the kind of skepticism that comes from 40 years of corporate warfare, his silver moustache twitching with barely concealed amusement at the audacity of working-class expertise. "And you know this how exactly?" His voice dripped with the condescension that successful men reserve for those they consider beneath their notice. "Did you learn advanced thermodynamics from YouTube videos while emptying our trash cans?" The laughter started again, sharp and cutting, echoing off the marble walls like the sound of shattering glass. But Cameron's expression never changed, his face a mask of professional calm that he'd perfected during 5 years of being invisible in plain sight. He simply stood there, hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that spoke of military training most of these executives had never experienced. His eyes remained fixed on the prototype, studying the machine like it held secrets that only he could understand. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, threatening to snap under the weight of unspoken truths. Veronica felt her pulse quicken as she watched the exchange unfold, her executive instincts warring with something deeper and more primitive. She'd built her reputation on reading people, on knowing exactly who belonged in her boardroom and who didn't. But this man, this janitor with his faded uniform and steady gaze, didn't fit any category she understood. There was something in his eyes that spoke of depths she hadn't expected, intelligence that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of corporate invisibility. "Scared?" she heard herself say, the word escaping before her MBA training could stop it. Her voice cut through the boardroom's tension like a blade through silk, carrying 5 years of accumulated frustration at being underestimated because of her age and gender. Easy to criticize from the sidelines when you've got nothing real at stake. The challenge hung between them like a loaded gun, dangerous and unpredictable in the hands of someone with nothing left to lose. The silence that followed was different from what had come before, heavy with possibility and fraught with consequences that none of them fully understood. Cameron's eyes met hers for the first time, and Veronica saw depths that challenged every assumption she'd made about invisible people who kept her world running while she slept. Pain, yes, but also something else. Something that looked dangerously like hope, wrapped in the kind of quiet desperation that comes from watching dreams die one day at a time. "I'll need proper tools," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying more authority than all the executive bluster that had preceded it. "And 2 hours." The word seemed to surprise him as much as everyone else in the room, as if they'd escaped from some deep place where his true self had been buried beneath years of careful invisibility. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, betraying the magnitude of what he was proposing to attempt. Patterson's face flushed red above his silk tie, the color rising like a thermometer measuring corporate panic and wounded pride in equal measure. "This is absolutely insane." He sputtered, his voice cracking on the words like thin ice under pressure. "We're talking about $3 million of precision engineering here, not some broken lawnmower that needs a tune-up." His protest revealed more fear than anger, the terror of a man watching his professional reputation crumble in real time. The other executives murmured their agreement like a Greek chorus of expensive suits protecting their own carefully constructed reputations. Walsh nervously calculated liability costs on his phone, while Henderson started composing mental resignation letters that would preserve his legacy if everything went wrong. But Veronica found herself nodding, caught in the gravitational pull of a decision that felt both completely reckless and utterly inevitable. 2 hours, she repeated, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest where her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The boardroom erupted in protests, voices overlapping like competing symphonies of panic and professional self-preservation. Henderson slammed his hand on the table, making the prototype shudder like a dying animal. Walsh dropped his phone, the plastic clattering against marble with a sound like breaking bones. But through it all, Cameron remained motionless, his attention fixed on the machine that had brought them all to this impossible moment. The maintenance supervisor arrived 23 minutes later, wheeling in a cart of tools that looked positively ancient compared to the high-tech diagnostic equipment scattered around the conference room like expensive jewelry. Cameron selected each instrument with the careful precision of a musician tuning his violin before Carnegie Hall, his weathered hands moving with surprising delicacy over implements that had seen decades of honest work. A torque wrench worn smooth by countless repairs. A thermal imaging scanner that had been state-of-the-art when Reagan was president. Wire strippers that clicked together like old friends sharing familiar secrets. "Everyone out," Cameron announced quietly, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms marked by years of honest labor and the kind of scars that come from learning hard lessons with sharp tools. Need concentration. Patterson bristled at the dismissal, his engineering degree from Stanford and corner office, with a view suddenly rendered meaningless by a man who emptied wastebaskets for minimum wage plus benefits. But something in Cameron's tone suggested this wasn't a request that was open to negotiation. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done, who had perhaps always known but had never been given the opportunity to prove it. The authority in his words came not from corporate hierarchy or educational credentials, but from the deeper well of competence that can't be faked or bought. Patterson found himself moving toward the door, despite every instinct telling him to assert his professional dominance over this obvious interloper. Veronica lingered at the doorway, unwilling to abandon her vigil over the company's future, but uncertain whether her presence would help or hinder whatever Cameron was planning to attempt. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline sparkled in the late afternoon sun, thousands of office workers going about their predictable lives in glass towers that rose like monuments to organized ambition. None of them knew that the fate of Sinclair Industries rested in the hands of a man whose name didn't appear on any organizational chart. Cameron had already begun his work, his movements methodical and sure as he approached the prototype, like a surgeon preparing for the most delicate operation of his career. He pressed his ear against the engine block, listening for the mechanical heartbeat that would tell him where the real problems lay. The metal was cold against his skin, but he could feel the potential energy locked inside, waiting for the right combination of knowledge and skill to set it free. The first hour passed in mechanical whispers that spoke a language most of the executives wouldn't recognize, the soft click of precision tools against engineered metal, the gentle hiss of compressed air clearing years of accumulated debris from sensitive components, the barely audible hum of diagnostic equipment that Cameron somehow coaxed into cooperation through methods that weren't taught in any business school curriculum. Each sound was a note in a complex symphony of repair and resurrection. Veronica found herself checking her Cartier watch every few minutes, each tick of the second hand marking another step closer to either corporate salvation or professional suicide. The Tokyo investors would be landing at O'Hare in 14 hours, their expectations calibrated to precision demonstrations and flawless presentations. If Cameron failed, she would have to explain to men who measured success in yen and market share why she had gambled her company's future on the promises of a night shift janitor. The other executives had retreated to the adjacent conference room, their nervous energy filling the space with cigarette smoke and anxious conversations that circled around the same unanswerable questions. What if he actually succeeds? What if he fails spectacularly? What does it mean for our jobs, our reputations, our carefully constructed professional identities if a man who pushes a mop cart knows more about advanced engineering than our entire technical staff? Patterson returned at the 90-minute mark, his face a carefully constructed mask of professional concern, tinged with something that looked suspiciously like hope, wrestling with terror. "Any progress?" he asked, his voice pitched to sound casual, but betraying the desperate need for reassurance that everything he'd built his career on wasn't about to collapse. Cameron didn't look up from the engine's electronic control unit, his fingers dancing across circuits with the delicacy of a pianist playing Chopin. "Multiple cascade failures," he replied without breaking concentration, his voice clinical and precise, in a way that made Patterson's stomach clench with recognition. "Thermal management systems completely backwards. Fuel delivery timings off by 0.3 seconds. Electronic control systems are fighting each other instead of coordinating." His diagnosis was delivered with the calm authority of someone who understood not just what was wrong, but why it had gone wrong in the first place. The thermal scanner in Cameron's hands painted the engine in shades of heat and possibility, revealing patterns that told stories of corporate failure, written in temperature differentials and voltage drops. Red zones where metal expanded beyond design limits, creating stress fractures that would eventually destroy the entire system. Blue valleys where coolant flow had been disrupted by installations that looked right to the untrained eye but violated fundamental principles of thermodynamics. Yellow corridors where electronic signals lost their way through pathways designed by people who understood theory but had never gotten their hands dirty with practical application. "That's impossible," Patterson muttered, but his protest lacked the conviction it would have carried 2 hours earlier. The data streaming across Cameron's scanner told a story that matched his own secret fears, the doubts he'd buried beneath layers of professional pride and expensive education. The prototype had been flawed from the beginning, built on assumptions that no one had dared to question, because questioning would have required admitting that their fundamental approach was wrong. Cameron's weathered hands moved with surgical precision, correcting thermal expansion joints that had been installed by engineers with advanced degrees and zero practical experience. Each adjustment was small, almost insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a symphony of mechanical harmony that had been missing from the system since its conception. He worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that this might be his only chance to prove that intelligence comes in many forms. Henderson appeared in the doorway like a harbinger of corporate doom, his silver hair perfectly styled, despite the chaos surrounding them, and his three-piece suit armor against the possibility of failure. "Veronica, this has gone far enough," he declared, with the authority of someone who'd survived 5 decades of boardroom warfare. "The Tokyo investors will be here in 14 hours, and we're gambling our reputation on a maintenance worker's hunches about technology he couldn't possibly understand." His words carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and institutional memory, the voice of someone who'd seen companies rise and fall on decisions far less reckless than entrusting their future to invisible employees. But they also carried the deeper fear that perhaps the comfortable assumptions that had guided his entire career were about to be shattered by a man whose existence he'd never bothered to acknowledge. But Veronica couldn't tear her gaze away from Cameron's methodical work, mesmerized by the way his hands moved across the engine's components with the familiarity of a pianist playing a beloved sonata. Something about his approach spoke to a deeper understanding that transcended the boundaries of corporate hierarchies and educational pedigrees. Each movement was purposeful, born from knowledge that had been earned rather than purchased, tested in the crucible of real-world application rather than theoretical study. The second hour brought breakthrough and revelation in equal measure, mechanical resurrection accompanied by the gradual exposure of truths that would reshape everyone's understanding of competence and value. Cameron's modifications began to show results on the diagnostic displays, green indicators replacing red warnings in a cascade of systematic improvement that spoke of fundamental problems being addressed rather than symptoms being masked. The prototype's electronic brain started communicating with its various systems for the first time since its assembly, forming connections that had been severed by months of well-intentioned but misguided repairs. But it was Cameron's notebook that stopped Veronica cold when she glimpsed it over his shoulder, the worn pages revealing a depth of knowledge that challenged every assumption she'd made about the invisible people who kept her world running. Pages covered with technical diagrams that rivaled anything her engineering department had produced in 18 months of development. Equations written in neat handwriting that spoke of advanced mathematical understanding applied to real-world problems. Design sketches that showed intimate familiarity with hybrid propulsion systems at a level that most engineers never achieved. This wasn't the notebook of a janitor collecting random observations. This was the work of someone who understood engineering at its deepest levels. "Who are you, really?" Veronica whispered. But Cameron was already moving to the final phase of his work, the critical moment where all his adjustments would either harmonize into success or collapse into expensive failure. The prototype's startup sequence required delicate timing, a symphony of mechanical and electronic components that had to dance together in perfect coordination. His fingers hovered over the ignition controls like a conductor preparing for the most important performance of his career. The boardroom held its breath as 14 people suspended themselves between hope and disaster, their collective future resting on the competence of a man they'd systematically ignored for 5 years. The silence was so complete that Veronica could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of corporate responsibility pressing against her chest like a physical force. Everything they'd built, everything they'd worked for, balanced on this single moment of truth. The engine turned over on the first try, a gentle rumble that built into a confident purr as systems that had been fighting each other for months finally learned to cooperate. The diagnostic displays painted the room in green light, every parameter showing optimal performance for the first time since the prototype's assembly. Cameron stepped back from the machine, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had seen more honest work than most of the suits in the building. His face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, no vindication for the years of invisibility he'd endured. Just the quiet competence of someone who'd done what needed to be done because it was the right thing to do. The prototype purred like a contented cat, its mechanical song filling the boardroom with the sound of $3 million, finally remembering how to fulfill its purpose. But Cameron was already cleaning his tools, methodically returning each instrument to its proper place in the worn toolbox that held more wisdom than their entire technical library. Patterson stared at the displays in shocked silence, watching his entire worldview crumble like a house built on sand and professional arrogance. The numbers didn't lie, couldn't be manipulated or explained away with corporate doublespeak. The janitor had succeeded where Stanford degrees and unlimited budgets had failed. The junior engineers crowded around the prototype, their excited chatter filling the room with the sound of careers being saved by someone they'd never bothered to notice. The thermal expansion joints were just the beginning, Cameron explained quietly, his voice barely audible over the prototype's steady mechanical heartbeat. The entire design philosophy was backwards from day one. You were trying to force an electric motor into a combustion framework instead of creating true integration between the systems. His words fell into the room like stones into deep water, creating ripples of understanding that reached every corner of their collective consciousness. Veronica felt the ground shift beneath her carefully constructed certainty, felt the comfortable assumptions that had guided her executive decisions crack like ice in spring sunshine. This man, this invisible member of her workforce, had just accomplished what her best minds couldn't manage in 18 months of concentrated effort and unlimited resources. But more than that, his explanation revealed depths of knowledge that challenged everything she thought she understood about intelligence, competence, and the value of human potential. The implications crashed over her like a tidal wave of recognition. How many other invisible geniuses walked her halls each night, emptying trash cans and mopping floors while carrying solutions to problems that kept her executives awake at night? How many brilliant minds had she overlooked because they wore work uniforms instead of business suits, because they carried mop buckets instead of leather briefcases? Henderson's background check arrived via secure email just as Cameron finished packing his tools, the digital file landing like a bomb in the boardroom's fragile ecosystem of assumptions and prejudices. MIT graduate, mechanical engineering, summa cum laude, class rank of 3 out of 247 students. Thesis on advanced hybrid propulsion systems that had been cited in 17 industry journals and formed the theoretical foundation for technologies still being developed by major automotive manufacturers. Previous employment at Brookstone Engineering, one of the most prestigious firms in the automotive sector, where he'd been the lead engineer on projects that had revolutionized fuel efficiency standards across the industry. Patents in his name that were still generating licensing fees for companies that had never acknowledged his contribution. Employment terminated in 2018 following a personal tragedy that no corporate database could adequately capture. Your wife, Veronica said softly, the pieces falling together like fragments of a shattered mirror, slowly reassembling into a picture of sacrifice that most executives would never comprehend. Cameron's hands stilled on his toolbox, his knuckles white against the worn metal handle that had supported him through 5 years of professional invisibility. The weight of unspoken grief settled over the boardroom like morning fog over still water. She died in 2018. Veronica continued, her voice gentle with newfound understanding. Car accident on the interstate left you with an 8-year-old daughter to raise alone. You walked away from everything you'd built professionally because Lily needed a father more than the world needed another brilliant engineer. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, carrying the weight of sacrifices that corporate spreadsheets could never adequately quantify. Cameron's nod was barely perceptible, a movement so small it might have been a trick of the fluorescent lighting that had witnessed 5 years of his invisible competence. Lily needed stability more than I needed recognition, he said finally, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of countless midnight decisions and small surrenders. Night shift custodian meant health insurance, predictable schedule, no business travel. Being invisible seemed like a fair trade for being present when she needed me. His words painted a picture of corporate existence that none of the executives had ever considered, a shadow world of people who kept their lives running while remaining perpetually unseen. The janitors who cleaned their offices while they slept, the security guards who protected their assets through long, lonely nights, the maintenance workers who fixed their problems before they even knew problems existed, an entire ecosystem of competence and dedication that operated below the threshold of executive awareness. The prototype continued its mechanical song, filling the boardroom with the sound of possibility restored and assumptions shattered. But Cameron's revelation had shifted the room's emotional gravity, transforming what should have been a simple triumph into something far more complex and meaningful. Veronica found herself seeing her company through different eyes, recognizing the countless invisible contributors who made her success possible while receiving none of its rewards or recognition. "The marriage proposal," she said quietly, remembering her desperate words from what felt like a lifetime ago, but had actually been only 2 hours of corporate transformation. The challenge that had started as cruel mockery now seemed like prophecy, a throwaway comment that had accidentally revealed truths none of them had been prepared to face. Cameron's smile was sad and knowing, the expression of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from the promises of people who lived in corner offices. "That was desperation talking," he replied, shouldering his toolbox with the practiced ease of someone preparing to disappear back into invisibility. "Desperate people say desperate things. I don't hold you responsible for words spoken in crisis." But something in his eyes suggested that desperation and honesty weren't mutually exclusive categories, that sometimes the truest words emerged when all pretense had been stripped away by necessity and fear. Patterson cleared his throat, his engineering pride warring with grudging respect, and the dawning recognition that everything he thought he knew about competence and credentials had been challenged by a man with calloused hands and genuine wisdom. "The integration methodology you used," he said carefully, his voice pitched to sound professional, but betraying deep curiosity about techniques that had escaped him entirely. "It's completely revolutionary. Where did you learn to think about hybrid systems that way?" Cameron paused at the doorway, his silhouette framed against the corridor's harsh fluorescent lighting that had been his primary companion for 5 years of professional exile. The weight of his toolbox pulled at his shoulder, but his posture remained straight, dignified in a way that expensive suits couldn't purchase or advanced degrees couldn't teach. "MIT thesis project, 2011, he said quietly. "Advanced hybrid propulsion integration, a paradigm shift. It gathered dust in university libraries for 13 years until today." The Tokyo presentation the following morning became something unprecedented in Sinclair Industries' corporate history, a celebration rather than the funeral they'd been preparing for just 18 hours earlier. The investors marveled at the prototype's performance, their technical experts unable to find flaws in Cameron's integration methodology or suggest improvements to systems that had been perfected through the marriage of theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Contracts were signed in duplicate with the smooth efficiency of properly aligned mechanical systems. $50 million flowing into Sinclair Industries' accounts like digital water finding its natural level. The press releases practically wrote themselves, celebrating breakthrough technology that would revolutionize the hybrid automotive industry. But Veronica found herself thinking not about profit margins or market positioning, but about the quiet man who'd made it all possible while asking for nothing in return. Cameron returned to his regular shift that evening, pushing his cleaning cart through the same corridors where executives celebrated his invisible triumph with champagne and congratulatory phone calls to board members who would never know his name. But something had changed in the building's atmosphere, a subtle shift that employees felt without fully understanding. The night janitor who emptied waste baskets and mopped floors had become something more, though most would never learn exactly what that transformation entailed. 2 weeks passed in a blur of media attention and industry recognition, with Sinclair Industries being featured on magazine covers and technology blogs as the company that had cracked the code of true hybrid integration. The stock price climbed to historic heights, making millionaires of executives who'd done nothing more than avoid complete failure. But late at night, when the building emptied of ambitious networking events and celebratory dinners, Veronica found herself thinking about engineering notebooks filled with unused genius. "I want to offer you Chief Engineering Officer," she said, finding Cameron in the basement maintenance shop where he spent his breaks with coffee that had been brewing the same bitter liquid for 15 years. He looked up from the technical manual he'd been reading, some obscure publication about thermodynamic efficiency that none of her actual engineers would have bothered to study. His expression was unreadable in the harsh, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like refugees from corporate purgatory. "Patterson's been promoted to senior director, but the department needs someone who understands integration at a fundamental level," she continued, her carefully prepared speech sounding hollow in the maintenance shop's utilitarian atmosphere. "Someone who thinks in systems rather than components, who sees connections that others miss." The words felt inadequate to express what she'd learned about hidden competence and wasted potential, about the difference between credentials and capability. Cameron's laugh was dry as autumn leaves, carrying no humor but plenty of accumulated wisdom about the gap between corporate promises and reliable reality. "I appreciate the gesture, Ms. Ashford, but executive titles don't change the fundamental equation of single parenthood," he said gently but firmly. "Lily comes first, always. Night shift works for her schedule. Executive meetings and business travel don't." His rejection was delivered with quiet authority, the voice of someone whose priorities had been forged in the furnace of genuine loss. But Veronica had spent 2 weeks thinking about integration in ways that transcended mechanical systems, considering how human needs and corporate structures might be redesigned to work together rather than in constant conflict. "What if we redesigned the position itself?" she asked, leaning forward with the intensity that had made her successful in boardrooms across 3 continents. Flexible schedule, family accommodations, no travel without advanced planning and childcare arrangements. What if we built a job around your life instead of forcing your life around corporate expectations? The conversation continued past midnight, 2 people from completely different worlds discovering common ground in unexpected places and shared recognition that genius comes in many forms. Cameron spoke about Lily's school schedule and therapy appointments, the delicate balance of single parenthood that most executives never considered when making demands about overtime and weekend availability. Veronica found herself redesigning corporate structure in real time imagining workplaces that valued results over face time, contribution over conformity. 6 months later, Sinclair Industries had become something unprecedented in corporate America, a company that had figured out how to succeed financially while honoring human complexity. The executive floor featured a daycare center where children played between engineering workstations, their laughter mixing with the sound of technical discussions about thermodynamic efficiency. Flexible schedules accommodated family obligations without sacrificing productivity, proving that competence could coexist with compassion. Night shift employees received the same benefits and advancement opportunities as their daytime counterparts, finally acknowledging that brilliant work could happen at any hour of the day or night. The maintenance staff attended monthly meetings where their insights shaped corporate strategy, their practical knowledge combining with executive vision to create solutions that neither group could have developed alone. The rigid hierarchies that had separated blue collars from corner offices began to dissolve, replaced by recognition that intelligence comes in many forms. Cameron's office overlooked the same conference room where everything had changed, but his door remained perpetually open in defiance of executive tradition. Lily did homework at a small desk in the corner, surrounded by prototype engines and technical drawings that she'd learned to navigate like playground equipment. The chief engineering officer title came with prestige and responsibility, but Cameron wore it like comfortable work clothes, never forgetting the toolbox that had brought him there or the lessons learned during 5 years of professional invisibility. The marriage proposal had evolved into something neither desperate nor mocking, growing organically from shared values and mutual respect rather than corporate convenience or social expectation. Veronica and Cameron discovered that genuine partnership required more than romantic chemistry, that successful relationships were built on foundations of trust, compatibility, and recognition that two complete people could create something stronger together than either could manage alone. Their wedding took place in the company courtyard on a spring morning when Chicago's skyline sparkled with possibility, officiated by Henderson and witnessed by everyone from board members to maintenance staff. It was a celebration that acknowledged how unconventional partnerships could transform conventional institutions, how love could grow in the most unlikely places when people were brave enough to see beyond surface appearances. Lily served as both flower girl and ring bearer, proud of her role in bringing two brilliant adults together through the medium of a broken engine and impossible circumstances. Her science fair project that year documented the entire journey from corporate crisis to family formation, proving with characteristic 8-year-old logic that the most important engineering sometimes involved human hearts rather than mechanical systems. The prototype that had started everything remained in the company lobby, its chrome surface polished to mirror brightness and its mechanical heart beating with quiet confidence. A small plaque explained its significance in words that most visitors wouldn't fully understand. Innovation comes from recognizing potential where others see problems. But employees smiled whenever they passed the monument to impossible transformations, knowing that their workplace had been built on the revolutionary idea that genius deserves recognition regardless of the uniform it wears. Later tonight, when the building settled into its familiar rhythms of cleaning and maintenance, Cameron still walked the corridors where his journey had begun. But now he carried the weight of leadership alongside his toolbox. His footsteps echoed differently in the marble hallways, no longer the sound of invisible labor, but the measured pace of someone who'd learned that corporate hierarchies were just another kind of system that could be repaired when the right person understood how all the pieces fit together. The engine hummed quietly in its display case, a mechanical heart that had brought 3 people together and taught an entire company that the most revolutionary integration wasn't electronic or mechanical, but human. The recognition that worth isn't determined by job title or educational credentials, but by the willingness to use whatever gifts you possess in service of something larger than yourself.